So I'm Basti, I'm the Analytics Instrumentation Engineering Manager. I have with me today Emma from the Product Analyst team. And we want to talk about how we want to handle tracking where an event happened with the new internal events system. So I just noted down the in the issue we were talking, kind of the status quo around how things were used previously. I'm just going to share that quickly so that to make sure that we have that's the same base understanding. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
And I hope it's readable enough. Cool.
Yep.
So from my understanding of what I checked, and I think also what you said, so the deprecated snowplow event tracking mainly used the category field for location tracking. On the technical side, so depending on actually which method someone used to implement tracking, because there's kind of multiple ways to implement tracking, depending on front end and back end and where you are in those. This was pre-populated, automatically per default populated with body dataset page or self class name, which kind of gave you automatic information, but it was overridable. So, and that was also actually used quite a bit. So it's not a given that these kind of programmatically derived values are in there. And I think also from what I understand from you, I mean, that's sometimes also a problem because then it's overwritten with something that might not be easily understandable or easily queryable. And one more thing I think that's important to understand is also that category is a mandatory field when using snowplow structured events, which we do. So that's why we currently always fill it with, I think, internal event tracking for the internal events, because we need to provide something. And so per default, any internal event that's currently tracked just writes internal event tracking into this field, into this category field. And that all aligns, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Cool. So what I want to create clarity on between the analytics and instrumentation side and the analyst side is how do we want to enable collecting this information again on internal events? Because I think that's a desire that we kind of share, and that should, I think we agree that it should be there, that we enable again collecting the location information.
Mm-hmm.
I think so from my perspective, one problem that I see with the previous solution and why I wouldn't just kind of copy it one-to-one was that it's kind of overridable and it's kind of easily or maybe even encouraged to override it. And so as soon as someone overrides the category information or previously wrote in their own category, we lose something. We lose some information, because suddenly the body data set page and the self.class.name, so those things that we can automatically add and that are always automatically calculated and that I think kind of stay pretty consistent, those would be lost, right? So, and that's, I think, also something that is hard to that's one of the aims with internal events, is to make it easy for people to instrument something, and putting them into the place where we tell them, hey, we calculate something automatically here, but you can override it if you want to. But if you do, then we lose some information. Like this kind of decision overhead. That's exactly what I'd like to avoid, or what I think we would aim to avoid.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I agree with that perspective. In my mind, I think from my perspective, an ideal solution would be your number 2, adding a location in the standard context that's not overridable. The other benefit in my mind to that solution is that I actually really like the fact that the category field currently for internal events tracking is collecting a label that says this was implemented using internal events tracking. And in that scenario, if that were to continue being the case, and instead of collecting location in category, collecting it in the standard context consistently, then we would have the ability to filter to events that were implemented using the new process. And so we would know that all of these events that are filtered to category equals internal events tracking are implemented in a standard and reliable way. And that's a benefit in my mind. A con to the solution number 2 is an analytics engineering problem, which I can't speak to as much. But having the data team having been involved with some of these conversations, I think they've been resistant to the idea of adding more to the context. Previously, the argument is if it's not going to be a predictable format, then that creates trouble, which I agree with. In this case, because adding location to the standard context would be predictable and reliable, I think that would be great. I don't know what their perspective on that would be, because they'd still need to remodel the data and add a new field to all of these snowplow data models that are very complex and branching. But in my mind, that would be a good thing, a good solution. I'm not sure what their perspective on the overhead of adding that field into all of the dimensional models, because I don't know if you know this, on the data team, they use the Kimball dimensional modeling, which requires all of these different layers. So it would just be, kind of a waterfall of needing to change different models, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think I roughly understand kind of the impact. Also having, when we recently had added or not too recently, we added this kind of is GitLab team member to the standard context, and I think, I don't know if it's even implemented by now. Like it also took quite a while to implement it.
Okay. And I don't think that would be a bad thing. As long as they would be on board with it, I think it would end up being a good thing. And then my third perspective is, oh, I had it in my brain. It's early. It's going to come to me. Okay. So my third perspective is, you'll probably know the answer to this. I'm not sure how changing the payload in the standard context to include another predictable value, would that impact our experiment context at all? I think those are two separate things. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's not connected to each other at all. It's like it's two different things.
Okay. So overall, I really like solution number 2. It just is a matter of, is the data team on board with the required work to include another field like the GitLab team member field that was just added. And I like the idea of keeping internal events value in the category field.
That's very interesting, because I think the one thing I was wondering, like when you said that, is, I mean, I generally agree that I think that it also would be beneficial in the sense of not having to tell users to come up with their own category, which again would kind of put a burden on them. On the other hand, it would make migration of existing events more complicated, because if we were to do that, any existing event which is normally sending its location to the category field would suddenly change, like when at the moment when we migrated, it would suddenly change from being sent to the category field to be sent to this location field. And I'm wondering, because that's a consistency issue, right? So from my understanding,
Right.
ideally, apart from maybe telling you somehow, okay, this is now migrated, this thing, I'm wondering if, from your analyst perspective, if it's not a bad thing if we kind of break consistency as soon as we migrate something. If it wouldn't be better if, like, we migrate something on our side and the only thing that maybe happens is that something gets added, but nothing gets changed or something, so that nothing is broken when doing a migration.
So what you're saying, I guess, what are the use cases for needing to migrate events? Because we've talked before in some of these threads about the perspective that engineers shouldn't have to migrate events unless there's some specific use case for them needing to do that. A lot of the analysts on my team for use cases where we have a really good understanding of how snowplow events were implemented in a certain location have specific query logic that's identifying those events and specific to all of the unique values that were captured in order to identify the behaviors we're interested in. And so in my mind, unless an event is net new and newly implemented, then all of the previous kind of funky logic can remain the same. And slowly we can kind of move into a new era of more standard implementation.
So the main reason why something would need to be migrated normally would be if from an analyst side or a customer success side or product management side, someone is interested in collecting the same metrics on top of the event data on self-managed, because that's what kind of internal events is also. It's about you suddenly we do not only when we migrate an existing snowplow event to internal events, we enable the developer and through that kind of the product manager or the customer success person to create a metric on top that would be calculated on self-managed.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so I guess the pro con situation that we're weighing then, or what I am weighing is the pro of already having a category value that where we're collecting the ability to identify events that were implemented via the new internal events method. Does that pro outweigh the having our location value in the same place it's always been, and kind of avoiding some of those problems with migration? So from that perspective, I think I would then lean towards solution one, because, you know, from your argument and hearing it that way, I do think that migration will be a more common situation than maybe I was thinking previously. And in that case, solution one will avoid a lot of messiness from that. And if other analysts or, you know, other members of the data team agree that it would be valuable to have a way to identify events that were implemented through the new methodology, then we could implement an iterative solution in the future where we're creating maybe a new value in the standard context that identifies it there.
Exactly. So we could kind of turn it on its head and just use the context for identifying.
And that could be, yeah, and that doesn't need to be this iteration thing, but that would be a good solution to kind of weighing those pros and cons in this decision. So I think solution one seems the best to me after talking it through.
Cool. One more question, because I think that's kind of aligned with, after thinking and going back and forth on this in my own mind, that it totally aligns with where I'm at right now. The one question I have is still the third point for solution one. So providing an override possibility for category, but discourage its use for anything other than event migrations. So that's my question, kind of whether you agree with that, because from my perspective, again, I would say we try to implement our methods always in a way that the same kind of information always gets collected. So this is this body dataset.page, or the class, so the controller or something from which it's sent. So try to create that in a consistent way. Open up the category field for the migrations, so that when an event has previously used, like put its own custom category there, then we allow that so that it doesn't break, and we can migrate it. But we tell everyone, okay, for new events, if you need to kind of provide additional location information or something for the analyst, then use one of the other fields. So the label, the property, whatever, some other way for providing that information, and do not override.
Yeah, I guess my question is, how confident do you feel in like your MR review capacity? Because it seems to me like if, and the implications from having it be able to be overrided, the implications on MR reviews, because I generally trust all of the engineers that I work with to abide by a recommendation like that and understand the reasoning. But if folks, all that's stopping them from overriding the category value is just reading through a recommendation in the implementation process, then there might be a little bit more work for your team on MR reviews if someone did override it, to kind of review why they did it and make sure it's appropriate. So that's the only concern in my mind, is if this might be creating a little bit more work and review time.
I think from my perspective that would be worth it, and I think like we can also make sure, like try to make sure as much as possible that this doesn't happen, so that only, so for example, just to give an example, we in the documentation around creating a new event and metric, we wouldn't even tell people about the fact that this field is available or overridable. We would just tell them, hey, the category automatically gets populated with this and that value, so that they know kind of how it's used and how they can query for it. That would probably then only be in the migration guide. And so kind of, and also changing the method signature in a way that it's that category is separate from all the other properties, so that to make it very clear to an implementer that you're doing something very special. Like you could put it into something separate that's like migration property category or something. So to make it very, very visible to someone that you're doing something that is normally not intended, where you like need to have a special reason to do so. And thereby, I think we can definitely minimize the risk. Because in my experience, I mean, when someone implements an event, they normally don't go out of the way to try to like look for the internal API or something, but are rather happy if they just kind of, if we give them the structure and don't expose it to them.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Really no concerns about that from an analyst perspective, especially in the context of this new process requiring engineers to add a little description of the event. Because if, in our new process, we're doing an analysis and see something is not adhering to the normal pattern, we can just look up the YAML file description of the event and see it was implemented in this certain way.
Yeah.
Yeah, no concerns about that. This all sounds good.